Winter arrived early in the kingdom of Ashmore, covering towers, forests, and villages beneath a flawless blanket of white that disguised every scar except those carried inside human hearts. Ice glittered across the palace windows like fractured diamonds, while cold sunlight poured through stained glass and painted the marble floors with crimson and gold. Nobles from every province gathered inside the grand hall, their jeweled garments shimmering beneath crystal chandeliers, eager to witness the ceremony that would determine the future Duchess of Blackwood. Rumors drifted between silk sleeves and jeweled fans like invisible smoke, growing darker with every whispered sentence. Everyone expected Duchess Eleanor Blackwood to stand proudly beside her husband, Duke Adrian Blackwood, carrying the heir who would secure the family's ancient legacy. Eleanor paused outside the towering bronze doors before entering, resting both hands protectively upon her rounded belly. 8 months of pregnancy had softened her graceful movements without diminishing her quiet dignity. Her pale rose gown flowed elegantly over her figure, embroidered with delicate silver vines that caught the winter light. Tiny pearls decorated her braided chestnut hair, while a sapphire pendant, Adrian's wedding gift, rested against her throat. She whispered gently to the child beneath her heart, promising that today would be the beginning of a brighter chapter. Despite the uneasy silence that had settled between herself and Adrian during recent weeks, she still believed love could survive misunderstanding. She lifted her chin, steadied her breathing, and stepped into the magnificent hall with calm determination. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her at once. Conversations faded. Musicians lowered their instruments. Eleanor noticed Adrian standing upon the elevated platform before the royal throne, dressed in black velvet trimmed with silver fur, every inch the commanding duke admired throughout the kingdom. His clean-shaven face remained composed, yet something troubled flickered behind his gray eyes before disappearing beneath practiced restraint. She offered him a hopeful smile, expecting him to cross the distance separating them. Instead, he remained motionless, his gloved hands clasped tightly behind his back as though every muscle in his body resisted an invisible command. The royal herald struck his staff against polished stone, silencing every lingering whisper. His voice echoed powerfully beneath the vaulted ceiling. Presenting Lady Vivian Ashcroft, future Duchess of Blackwood. The announcement shattered Eleanor's world more completely than any falling cathedral could have done. A breathtaking blonde woman emerged wearing ivory silk adorned with golden embroidery and a magnificent diamond tiara reserved for the duchy's future mistress. She walked confidently toward Adrian, accepting every admiring glance without hesitation. When she reached the platform, Adrian extended his arm. Vivian placed her hand upon it before the assembled court. Thunderous applause filled the hall. Eleanor did not hear it. Only the pounding of her own heart remained. The child inside her shifted suddenly, as though sensing the violent fracture opening within its mother's soul. A noblewoman near the front covered a mocking smile behind her jeweled fan. I suppose carrying his child wasn't enough. Another laughed quietly. The Duke has finally found someone worthy. The words struck harder than winter wind. Eleanor searched Adrian's face, silently begging him to deny the nightmare unfolding before her. His gaze met hers only briefly. Pain flashed across his features before vanishing beneath cold discipline. He said nothing. Not one word. The silence condemned her more cruelly than accusation ever could. Servants approached with rehearsed precision. One gently removed the ceremonial mantle embroidered with the Blackwood crest from Eleanor's shoulders. Another requested her signet ring. A third bowed politely while asking her to surrender the Duchess's ribbon worn across her gown. Every gesture appeared respectful, yet together they stripped away her place before the entire kingdom. Humiliation swept through the watching crowd. Some pitied her. Most simply enjoyed the spectacle. Lady Margaret Hensley, Eleanor's ambitious maternal aunt, stepped forward with calculated elegance. Rather than offering comfort, she slapped Eleanor sharply across the cheek. The sound echoed through the silent chamber. "You have disgraced our family," she declared loudly. "Learn to leave with dignity." No one challenged her. Not even Adrian. The burning sting across Eleanor's face mattered far less than the unbearable emptiness blooming inside her chest. Her breathing became uneven. A sharp pain tightened across her abdomen. She instinctively held her belly as another contraction rippled unexpectedly through her body. It passed quickly, but fear remained. She could not collapse before these people. She would not allow strangers to remember her only as the abandoned wife who fell crying across palace marble. She straightened slowly. Her tears remained unshed. If Adrian wished the kingdom to believe she meant nothing, she would at least leave with the dignity he had failed to protect. Without another glance toward the platform, Eleanor turned and began walking through the center of the crowded hall. People stepped aside. No one reached for her. Behind her, applause resumed as musicians played triumphant fanfares celebrating Vivian's presentation. Each joyful note became another wound. Outside, bitter wind greeted her like an old enemy. Snowflakes drifted across the palace courtyard, covering carriage tracks almost as quickly as they formed. Her loyal driver hurried forward, alarmed by her pale expression, while stable boys loaded her belongings without asking questions. None of them understood why the Duchess had suddenly become unwanted. High above the entrance balcony, Adrian watched unseen from behind carved stone columns. His hands trembled so violently that his gloves creaked. Hidden inside his cloak rested a sealed parchment delivered only moments before the ceremony, bearing proof that assassins waited beyond the palace walls with orders to murder Eleanor before dawn. If he publicly defended her, the conspirators would strike immediately. If they believed she had been discarded, perhaps they would delay long enough for his secret guards to uncover the traitor directing them. He whispered an apology the wind carried away. Eleanor's carriage disappeared into the whitening storm. Far across the courtyard, one frightened stable boy glanced between the departing carriage and the Duke's devastated face, then quietly mounted a small horse and followed, convinced the terrible story unfolding had only just begun. Snow swallowed the road almost as soon as Eleanor's carriage left the palace gates, erasing every wheel mark beneath fresh drifts as though the kingdom itself wished to bury what had happened inside the grand hall. The horses strained against the icy wind, their breath rising in frantic white clouds while frozen branches clawed at the carriage roof. Eleanor sat silently beneath a wool blanket, one trembling hand pressed against her aching belly and the other clutching the sapphire pendant Adrian had fastened around her neck on their wedding day. Every painful memory from the ceremony echoed through her thoughts until she could scarcely distinguish heartbreak from the relentless howl of the storm outside. Her elderly driver, Thomas, glanced repeatedly through the small carriage window, concern deepening across his weathered face. He had served the Blackwood family for more than 30 years and had watched Eleanor grow from a timid young bride into a compassionate duchess beloved by servants and villagers alike. Nothing about the Duke's public rejection made sense to him, yet loyalty prevented him from speaking the questions crowding his mind. Instead, he urged the horses onward, determined to reach the safety of a nearby coaching inn before darkness swallowed the mountains entirely. Another sharp contraction tightened across Eleanor's abdomen, stealing her breath. She closed her eyes and fought the wave of pain without making a sound. The child responded with gentle movement beneath her hands, reminding her that despair was now a luxury she could no longer afford. Whatever Adrian had chosen, whatever explanation remained hidden behind his silence, she could not surrender to grief while another innocent life depended upon her courage. She whispered a promise that no winter, no betrayal, and no cruel court would ever diminish the love waiting for the little soul she carried. Far behind the carriage, the stable boy named Samuel urged his small chestnut horse through deepening snow. Barely 16, he possessed more determination than experience, yet he could not forget the anguish he had glimpsed on both Eleanor's and Adrian's faces. He kept his distance, fearing discovery, but refused to abandon the Duchess completely. Every instinct warned him that the storm concealed dangers greater than frozen roads. His fears proved justified. Hidden among towering pines, 5 masked riders watched the carriage approach. Thick white cloaks blended perfectly with the snow-covered forest, making them nearly invisible until they urged their horses forward. Steel flashed beneath their cloaks as curved swords emerged into the pale afternoon light. Their leader raised one gloved hand, silently directing the others into position across the narrow mountain pass. Thomas saw them first. "Your Grace," he shouted. "Hold tight." He snapped the reins sharply, sending the frightened horses lunging forward. The carriage bounced violently across frozen ruts as the attackers gave chase. Snow exploded beneath pounding hooves while arrows sliced through the bitter air. One shaft buried itself deep within the carriage door. Another struck the rear wheel, splintering wood without slowing the desperate flight. Eleanor wrapped both arms around her unborn child, praying only that the baby survived whatever fate awaited them. The carriage rocked violently from side to side, every jolt sending fresh agony through her body. Outside, Thomas fought desperately to outrun the riders despite the impossible conditions. The mountain road curved beside a steep ravine hidden beneath snow. One terrified horse slipped. Its legs collapsed across solid ice. The entire carriage lurched sideways before crashing through a wooden barrier and tumbling down a frozen embankment, which shattered. Glass exploded. The world became a whirl of splintered timber, screaming horses, and blinding snow until everything stopped with terrifying suddenness. Silence followed. Eleanor found herself trapped beneath broken beams, unable to move her legs. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow, but her first instinct was to cradle her belly. The baby still moved. Relief lasted only a heartbeat. Voices drifted down the hillside. They cannot have survived. Search anyway. The assassins. Thomas lay several yards away beneath the snow, his faithful body shielding one of the fallen horses. He did not move again. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision, yet terror forced them back. She remained perfectly still as heavy boots crunched closer. One assassin thrust a spear through the shattered carriage, narrowly missing her shoulder before withdrawing it. Another laughed coldly. The Duke's unwanted wife has finally disappeared. They searched only briefly before the worsening blizzard drove them toward shelter. Convinced no one could survive the freezing night beneath the wreckage, they rode away without realizing Eleanor still breathed. Minutes stretched endlessly. Cold seeped through her soaked clothing. Another contraction gripped her body, stronger than before. She bit her lip until she tasted blood rather than cry out into the empty wilderness. As darkness gathered, a distant lantern flickered between the snow-covered trees. An elderly woman appeared, wrapped in a patched gray cloak, leaning upon a sturdy walking staff. Deep lines marked her face, yet her blue eyes remained fiercely alert. She was Sister Agnes, once a battlefield surgeon before dedicating her remaining years to serving a remote mountain monastery. Returning from delivering medicines to isolated villages, she noticed the broken branches and frightened horse wandering riderless through the storm. She hurried toward the wreckage despite the deep snow. Finding Eleanor trapped, she immediately knelt beside her. "Stay awake," she whispered gently. "You are not alone." With remarkable strength, Agnes cleared shattered beams one by one. Her weathered hands bled against splintered wood, yet she ignored every injury until Eleanor was finally free. Wrapping the younger woman inside her own heavy cloak, she fashioned a rough sled from broken carriage panels and pulled her slowly across the frozen landscape toward the monastery hidden high among the cliffs. The journey lasted hours. Wind lashed their faces. Snow buried their footprints almost instantly. Several times Agnes nearly collapsed from exhaustion, but each time Eleanor's faint breathing reminded her that surrender meant 2 innocent deaths instead of 1. At last warm candlelight appeared beyond ancient stone walls. Monks rushed forward, carrying Eleanor inside as bells echoed through the quiet monastery. They laid her beside a crackling fire while Agnes issued calm instructions with practiced authority. Herbal medicines were prepared. Blankets surrounded her trembling body. Gentle prayers filled the small infirmary as labor pains intensified far sooner than anyone expected. Just before dawn, amid the fading roar of the blizzard, a tiny cry pierced the stillness. A baby girl entered the world. Agnes placed the child against Eleanor's chest, smiling through exhausted tears as mother and daughter clung to one another for the first time. Outside, the storm finally began to settle, leaving untouched snow stretching across the mountains like a blank page awaiting a new story. Yet far below, hidden beneath the overturned carriage, one overlooked object remained half buried beneath the ice. The royal assassination order bearing the unmistakable seal of the Blackwood family itself, waiting for the wrong hands to discover it first. Winter settled over Ashmore with relentless cruelty, covering roads, rooftops, and forgotten graves beneath endless white, yet no frozen landscape matched the emptiness consuming Duke Adrian Blackwood. 3 days had passed since Eleanor's carriage vanished into the storm. Search parties returned with broken wagon wheels, blood-stained splinters, and the frozen body of Thomas, but neither Eleanor nor the child she carried could be found. The kingdom quietly accepted the obvious conclusion. The abandoned Duchess had perished somewhere beneath the snow. Only Adrian refused to believe that winter had claimed them so completely. He stood alone inside the deserted grand hall where the cruel ceremony had unfolded, staring at the polished marble floor where Eleanor had endured her humiliation without shedding a single tear. Every echo reminded him of the applause that still haunted his dreams. He replayed the moment she searched his face for reassurance, remembering the hope that had slowly died inside her eyes when he remained silent. His chest tightened until breathing itself became painful. He had believed sacrificing her trust would preserve her life. Instead, his silence had delivered her into the hands of murderers. The heavy doors opened quietly behind him. Captain Roland Mercer, commander of Blackwood's personal guard, approached carrying a weathered leather satchel recovered from the wreckage. His expression revealed the truth before he spoke. "We found this beneath the overturned carriage, Your Grace." Adrian accepted the satchel with trembling hands. Inside rested Eleanor's gloves, the sapphire ribbon from her hair, and a folded sketch of the nursery they had designed together only weeks earlier. Small handwritten notes surrounded the drawing. She had listed children's stories she hoped to read aloud, lullabies her own mother had once sung, and flowers she wanted planted outside the nursery window so their child would always wake to color after winter ended. A single tear landed upon the paper. Adrian carefully folded the drawing against his heart. For the first time since childhood, the Duke of Blackwood wept openly. Roland remained silent, allowing grief to finish what pride no longer could. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice carried quiet devastation. "I failed them." Before Roland could answer, another guard hurried into the hall holding a sealed document wrapped inside oilcloth. It had been discovered frozen beneath layers of snow farther down the mountainside. Adrian broke the seal. His blood turned cold. The parchment contained a detailed assassination order describing Eleanor's movements, carriage route, and estimated time of departure. At its bottom, pressed into crimson wax, stood the unmistakable Blackwood family seal. Not a forgery. Not an imitation. Someone with direct access to his own household had ordered his wife's murder. Adrian stared at the seal for several silent moments before folding the document with terrifying calm. "Close every gate." Roland understood immediately. "No one leaves the estate?" "No one." The order spread through Blackwood Castle within minutes. Servants whispered nervously. Noble guests suddenly found themselves unable to depart. Every ledger, letter, and account book was seized. Private chambers were searched. Trusted stewards became suspects overnight. Adrian no longer cared about reputation. Only truth. Meanwhile, rumors spread far beyond the castle walls. Traveling merchants claimed the Duke had discarded his pregnant wife for another woman before arranging her disappearance. Village women spat whenever Blackwood riders passed. Children repeated cruel stories they overheard from their parents. To the kingdom, Adrian had become the face of heartless nobility. He never denied the accusations. He accepted every insult without explanation because revealing the assassination plot would warn the conspirators before he uncovered them completely. Days became weeks. Snow deepened across Ashmore. Every morning Adrian rode beyond the estate before sunrise with only Roland beside him. They searched abandoned cottages, frozen rivers, shepherd shelters, roadside chapels, and isolated mountain farms. Every report mentioning an injured noblewoman drew him farther into the wilderness. Every report ended in disappointment. One afternoon they discovered a small scarf caught upon thorn bushes overlooking a frozen stream. Adrian recognized the embroidery immediately. Eleanor had stitched it herself. Hope surged through him until an elderly shepherd explained the scarf had been carried downstream weeks earlier after heavy snowfall. No woman had been seen nearby. Adrian accepted the cloth silently. That evening he sat beside a lonely campfire turning the scarf between his fingers until dawn. Its faint scent of lavender had almost disappeared. Back at the castle, luxury became unbearable. He ordered grand banquets cancelled. Musicians dismissed. Lavish celebrations abandoned. The ballroom remained locked. Instead, he opened Blackwood granaries to villages suffering through the brutal winter. Wagons loaded with grain, blankets, and medicine departed daily under his personal seal. When advisors protested the enormous expense, Adrian answered quietly. "Wealth that cannot save lives deserves to disappear." Soon people noticed something unexpected. The Duke himself accompanied every supply convoy. He carried sacks beside laborers, lifted injured children into warm wagons, helped rebuild cottages crushed beneath heavy snow. When an old widow refused charity out of pride, Adrian repaired her roof through the night without revealing his name. Only at sunrise did she recognize the noble crest stitched upon his worn cloak. Word spread. Some villagers softened toward him. Others insisted guilt alone motivated his kindness. Adrian welcomed either judgment. Nothing anyone said matched the punishment already living inside his own conscience. One evening a messenger arrived breathless from a nearby valley. An avalanche had buried several travelers beneath collapsing ice. Without hesitation Adrian rode toward the mountains. Snow still thundered down unstable slopes as he joined frightened villagers digging desperately with bare hands. Hours passed before a child's muffled cry echoed beneath packed snow. Ignoring Roland's warning, Adrian crawled into the unstable collapse. Timbers shifted. Ice cracked overhead. He reached the trapped boy moments before another section collapsed around them. Shielding the child beneath his own body, Adrian endured falling debris until rescuers pulled them free. The boy survived. Adrian emerged bleeding from his shoulder, his hands torn raw by frozen stone. The grateful villagers thanked him with tears. He accepted none of their praise. Looking toward the endless mountains, he whispered only Eleanor's name. As the rescued travelers warmed themselves inside a remote chapel, an elderly nun studying Adrian's injured hands paused suddenly. Her weathered eyes widened with recognition. "I have seen those rings before," she murmured. Adrian looked up sharply. The nun explained that months earlier, during the height of the blizzard, an exhausted elderly healer wearing identical blackwood signet markings upon a patient's belongings had passed through the northern mountain monastery carrying a heavily pregnant young noblewoman barely clinging to life. The woman had survived the journey, though the healer refused to reveal her identity to protect her from dangerous men searching nearby. Hope crashed into Adrian with overwhelming force. For the first time since the terrible ceremony, possibility outweighed despair. He seized the nun's trembling hands. "Tell me where." She hesitated, fear clouding her expression before quietly answering. "The monastery no longer stands empty, Your Grace, but if those hunting her discovered it first, you may already be riding into another trap." The northern monastery stood hidden among towering pines where snow muffled every sound except the wind brushing ancient stone walls. Adrian and Roland reached its weathered gates after 2 days of relentless riding, their horses exhausted, their cloaks stiff with ice. Monks welcomed them cautiously but exchanged uneasy glances when Adrian revealed Eleanor's name. The oldest monk lowered his eyes with quiet sorrow before explaining that an injured noblewoman had indeed arrived during the great blizzard, carrying a newborn daughter, but she had departed months earlier after recovering her strength. She refused to reveal where she intended to go because she believed powerful enemies still hunted her child. Hope survived, yet certainty slipped away once again. Before Adrian could ask another question, Sister Agnes entered the chapel carrying a small wooden chest. She recognized the Duke immediately. Silence filled the room as she studied the man whose decision had shattered Eleanor's heart. At last she placed the chest upon a rough oak table and slowly lifted its lid. Inside rested Eleanor's sapphire pendant, several letters she had written without sending, and a tiny knitted blanket wrapped carefully around a silver rattle. Agnes explained that Eleanor had left these behind intentionally, believing Adrian deserved to know their daughter had survived, but only after the people responsible for the attack were exposed beyond doubt. Adrian unfolded the first letter with trembling hands. Eleanor had written not with anger but with aching honesty. She confessed that every instinct urged her to hate him, yet her memories refused to erase the gentle husband who had once planted roses beneath her window and read stories to the unborn child each evening. She admitted she could not reconcile that loving man with the silent Duke who had allowed another woman to claim her place. The unanswered question hurt more deeply than betrayal itself. Adrian closed his eyes, realizing that truth delayed had become its own terrible cruelty. Agnes then produced the assassination order recovered from the mountains after the attack. Unlike the damaged copy Adrian possessed, this version carried additional markings hidden beneath melted wax. Tiny coded symbols surrounded the blackwood seal, identifying officials who had approved the murder. Agnes had recognized military shorthand from her years serving battlefield commanders. The conspiracy reached far beyond jealous relatives. Someone inside the royal administration had helped disguise the crime. Adrian immediately returned to Blackwood Castle with renewed purpose. Every document seized during previous investigations was examined again. Forgotten account books, shipping records, and private correspondence suddenly revealed connections previously overlooked. Vast sums of money had disappeared from Blackwood estates for nearly 20 years, diverted through charitable foundations that existed only on paper. Supplies purchased for soldiers never reached the frontier. Relief funds intended for widows vanished before leaving treasury vaults. Every fraudulent transaction eventually pointed toward the same influential circle surrounding Eleanor's maternal uncle, Lord Cedric Hensley. Cedric had spent decades cultivating the image of a generous statesman while quietly enriching himself through theft. Eleanor's marriage threatened everything because Adrian insisted upon auditing family finances after becoming Duke. When Eleanor announced her pregnancy, Cedric realized an heir would permanently secure Blackwood authority and expose every stolen fortune. Eliminating both mother and child became the simplest path toward preserving his empire of deception. The public humiliation inside the Grand Hall had merely disguised a murder already carefully planned. Roland uncovered another astonishing truth. Lady Vivian Ashcroft had never been Adrian's mistress. She served the crown as a confidential investigator specializing in aristocratic corruption. Months earlier the king secretly ordered her to infiltrate Cedric's circle after suspicious treasury losses surfaced across several duchies. Presenting her publicly as the future Duchess had convinced the conspirators that Adrian valued ambition above family. They believed Eleanor abandoned and politically irrelevant, making their attack appear motivated by jealousy rather than calculated inheritance. Adrian had accepted becoming history's villain because he believed temporary hatred might preserve Eleanor's life. Instead, Cedric accelerated his timetable before investigators gathered enough evidence. The revelation spread quietly among trusted officials before the king summoned a closed tribunal inside the capital. Nobles who had applauded Eleanor's humiliation now entered the chamber expecting routine testimony. Instead they faced ledgers, forged wills, coded military orders, and sworn witnesses rescued from hidden prisons. One steward confessed to altering estate records under Cedric's instructions. Another admitted bribing judges to dismiss complaints from cheated veterans. Every confession strengthened the web surrounding the conspirators until denial became impossible. Cedric maintained arrogant composure throughout the proceedings. He insisted every accusation originated from a grieving husband desperate to rewrite public opinion. His confidence faltered only when Samuel, the stable boy who had secretly followed Eleanor's carriage, entered the chamber. Samuel described seeing masked riders waiting along the mountain pass hours before the attack. More importantly, he identified one assassin by a distinctive silver hawk emblem stitched inside his glove. Royal guards immediately produced identical emblems seized from Cedric's private guards during recent searches. The chamber erupted into stunned silence. Cedric's shoulders finally sagged. Without raising his voice, Adrian placed the original assassination order before him. "You murdered your own niece for gold." Cedric stared at the crimson seal bearing Blackwood authority. Tears never came. Regret never surfaced. Only bitterness remained. "I protected the future I built," he answered coldly. "Love has never governed kingdoms. Wealth does." Those words destroyed the last illusion surrounding him. The tribunal declared every conspirator guilty of treason, murder, fraud, and conspiracy against the crown. Estates were confiscated. Titles stripped away. Hidden fortunes returned to villages, soldiers, and widows they had robbed for decades. News of the verdict spread across Ashmore like spring sunlight piercing endless winter. The same people who once condemned Eleanor now mourned the injustice she had endured, while Adrian's silence finally acquired its tragic explanation. Yet victory brought no peace. Eleanor remained missing. Their daughter had vanished with her into a world that believed the Duke responsible for everything. Late that evening Agnes quietly approached Adrian before he departed the capital. She handed him a folded map marked with a single blue star high among distant northern valleys. Smiling through weary eyes, she whispered, "She promised that when truth finally defeated lies, she would stop running. If your heart deserves another chance, follow this road before the first thaw, because someone very small has been asking every night when her father will finally find them." The journey north began before dawn beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Fresh snow softened every ridge and valley, yet Adrian Blackwood urged his horse forward with a determination that ignored exhaustion, hunger, and the wounds winter had carved into his body. Roland rode beside him without complaint, understanding that no army, no title, and no crown could stop a husband racing toward the family he had nearly lost forever. Folded safely inside Adrian's coat rested Agnes's map, its single blue star glowing in his imagination like the first hopeful light after an endless night. The road narrowed as they climbed into the northern valleys. Pine forests surrounded them, their branches heavy with sparkling snow that shimmered beneath pale sunlight. Smoke finally appeared beyond a frozen stream, curling gently above rooftops hidden among the trees. Adrian slowed his horse as the village emerged from the whiteness. It was unlike any settlement he had ever seen. Every cottage had been repaired with care despite the harsh winter. Children laughed while carrying baskets of bread. Elderly widows embroidered blankets beside bright windows. Injured veterans chopped firewood together without shame or bitterness. The village carried an atmosphere not merely of survival, but of healing. Near its center stood the old monastery. Its once crumbling walls had been restored. Its neglected gardens were now covered with neat paths winding through snow-laden pines. Above the entrance hung no noble crest. Instead, a carved wooden plaque bore only 3 simple words. "Hope lives here." Adrian dismounted slowly. His heartbeat thundered louder than the church bells echoing across the valley. A little girl ran laughing across the courtyard, chasing 2 orphan boys who threw handfuls of snow into the crisp winter air. She could not have been older than 3. Thick chestnut curls framed her rosy cheeks. Bright gray eyes sparkled beneath long lashes. Around her tiny neck hung a familiar sapphire pendant, shortened carefully with a blue ribbon. Adrian stopped breathing. Those eyes, they were his own. The little girl noticed the strangers standing beside the gate. She tilted her head with innocent curiosity before walking toward Adrian without fear. "You look sad," she said softly. Her small voice carried the warmth of spring. Adrian knelt until they stood eye to eye. "What is your name?" he whispered. "Clara." His vision blurred instantly. "And your mother?" The little girl smiled proudly. "Mama says she's the happiest woman in the valley." Before Adrian could ask another question, the monastery doors opened quietly. Eleanor stepped outside. Time itself seemed to pause. She wore a deep sapphire winter cloak trimmed with white fur over a simple wool dress, far humbler than anything she had worn as Duchess. Her chestnut hair rested in a graceful braid beneath a knitted hood, and although winter had refined her features with quiet strength, her gentle smile remained exactly as he remembered. She looked healthy, confident, and peaceful in a way the palace had never allowed. For several silent moments neither spoke. Snow drifted gently between them. Clara looked from one face to the other. "Mama?" Eleanor slowly walked forward, resting one hand upon her daughter's shoulder. Adrian removed his gloves. "I have imagined this moment every day." "So have I," Eleanor answered calmly. "But not always happily." Her honesty struck deeper than accusation. "I know." He lowered his head. "I failed you." "You did." No anger colored her voice. Only truth. "I thought you no longer loved me. I never stopped. I believed you chose another woman. I chose a desperate plan. You chose silence." Every word carried years of sorrow compressed into a single sentence. Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "I deserve every ounce of your pain." She studied him carefully. Gone was the proud duke who once commanded magnificent ballrooms. Before her stood a man worn by regret, weather, sleepless nights, and relentless searching. His hands bore scars. His face had grown thinner. His eyes carried grief no crown could conceal. Eleanor recognized something impossible to counterfeit. Remorse. Clara gently tugged Eleanor's sleeve. "Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Why is he crying?" Eleanor looked back toward Adrian. "He has carried a very heavy winter." Clara walked toward him. Without hesitation she wrapped both tiny arms around his neck. Children often sense truth before adults permit themselves to believe it. Adrian embraced her carefully, overwhelmed by emotions words could no longer contain. His daughter. Alive. Warm. Laughing. Real. For the first time in years, hope outweighed guilt. The villagers quietly gathered around the courtyard. None interrupted. Many already knew the entire story through Agnes. Some had witnessed Eleanor arrive nearly frozen to death years earlier. Others had watched her transform abandoned buildings into schools, workshops, and shelters. She had taught widows to sew again, found work for injured soldiers, fed orphan children every winter, opened the monastery doors to anyone abandoned by society. Nobody addressed her as Duchess. They simply called her Lady Eleanor, the woman who never turned anyone away. Agnes approached carrying the same wooden chest Adrian had opened weeks before. She smiled gently. The truth finally arrived before spring. Roland quietly stepped beside Adrian. The king's carriage approaches. Moments later royal banners appeared beyond the snowy road. King Edward himself entered the monastery courtyard accompanied only by a small escort. Every villager bowed. The king walked directly toward Eleanor. He removed his gloves. Then, before nobles, soldiers, villagers, widows, and orphan children, the king bowed deeply to her. "I failed to protect one of the finest women in my kingdom." Silence covered the valley. He turned toward Adrian. "And you failed to trust the woman you loved." Adrian accepted the judgment without protest. The king smiled gently. "But today is not a day for punishment." He addressed the gathered crowd. For 20 years Lord Cedric Hensley and his allies stole from widows, soldiers, and children. Recovered fortunes had already begun rebuilding villages throughout Ashmore. One woman accomplished more with compassion than corrupt men achieved with wealth. The villagers applauded Eleanor not as a duchess, but as the woman who had restored countless broken lives. Adrian stepped forward. He removed the blackwood ducal ring from his finger, then slowly knelt before Eleanor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "I cannot erase the day I broke your heart." His voice trembled. "I cannot return the years fear stole from us." He placed the ring upon the snow between them. I offer neither title nor palace. He looked toward Clara. I ask only for the chance to spend the rest of my life earning back the family I almost destroyed. The valley remained completely silent. Eleanor looked at the ring, then at Adrian, then toward the people surrounding them. These villagers had become her family. They expected nothing, demanded nothing, loved freely. She slowly lifted the ring from the snow. I will never forget the pain. I would never ask you to. I cannot pretend those years never happened. I know. She reached down, not to return the ring, but to take Adrian's trembling hand. Then we begin again. Tears filled countless eyes. Clara laughed happily before placing both of her tiny hands over theirs. The villagers erupted into joyful applause. Church bells rang across the valley. Snowflakes drifted through golden afternoon sunlight like tiny blessings descending from heaven. Months later, the restored Blackwood estate reopened, not as an isolated palace but as the center of a charitable foundation jointly led by Adrian and Eleanor. The monastery remained open under royal protection, receiving permanent funding from the crown. Every estate stolen by Cedric's conspiracy was returned to its rightful owners. War widows received pensions. Orphans found homes. Veterans became teachers, craftsmen, and guardians instead of forgotten beggars. The wealth once hoarded through corruption flowed back into the lives it had been stolen from. When spring finally arrived, the kingdom gathered once more inside the same grand hall where Eleanor had once stood humiliated and abandoned. This time there were no cruel whispers, no mocking smiles, and no false ceremonies. The king invited Eleanor to stand beside him, not because she was the Duchess of Blackwood, but because she had become the conscience of the kingdom. Before the entire court, Adrian renewed his marriage vows with no crown placed above them, only Clara standing between her parents holding both their hands. The hall that had once echoed with applause for deception now thundered with cheers for truth, forgiveness, and love. And long after the snow had melted from the mountains, the people of Ashmore remembered only one lesson from that unforgettable winter. Kingdoms are preserved by power, but families are restored only by courage, truth, and hearts willing to forgive.